tonight to celebrate Enid's 150th birthday, which is actually on Sunday.
So my name is Heather Potter. I am the curator of photographs and prints here at the Filson Historical Society and also the curator of our Enid Yandell exhibition right now. We are glad you were able to join us tonight. So I have the honor of introducing Dr. Juilee Decker. I met Juilee over 6 years ago now, and because of Juilee and her research, Enid Yandell, Life of Art and Activism, kind of naturally was created in the Special Collections Reading Room here at the Filson. Okay, so Dr. Decker will be discussing her newest book, Enid Yandell, Kentucky's Pioneer Sculptor. Juilee is an associate professor of museum studies in the Department of Performing Arts and Visual Culture in the College of Liberal Arts at Rochester Institute of Technology. She is trained as an art historian. Her research and scholarship are at the intersection of museum studies, public history, and public art. Dr. Decker is an author, scholar, facilitator, and collaborator in the academy, as well as in cultural institutions and communities. Her monograph, Enid Yandell, Kentucky's Pioneer Sculptor, was published by the University Press of Kentucky in 2019. Decker has curated/co-curated numerous exhibitions focusing on art, material culture, and public history, and has served as a consultant to public art projects and programs in the U.S. She has served on the board of the National Susan B. Anthony Museum and House, and is a juror of the Education Committee of the American Alliance of Museums. Dr. Decker earned her Ph.D. in 2003 for the Joint Program in Art History and Museum Studies at Case Western Reserve University and the Cleveland Museum of Art. So please join me in wholeheartedly welcoming Dr. Juilee Decker.
So thank you, Heather, and thank you to everyone from the Filson who has helped to bring this evening's event here, and also others who have been involved in the Enid Yandell celebrations. It's been really exciting for me to see from afar. I did live in Kentucky for 10 years in Georgetown, and so it's been really a delight. So the format of my talk, it's about 40 minutes. It's a bunch of slides, so hold on. We're getting ready for a ride, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions. So who is Enid Yandell? I pondered this question when I was charged with the task several years ago to oversee an inventory of the art collection owned by Georgetown College. Enid created a bust in honor of an esteemed mathematics professor that had no known location at that moment. And I should say the sculpture probably already knew where it was. It's just we had no clue where it had wandered off to. So after scouring the nooks and crannies of the campus, a few days later, we discovered the bronze tucked in one of the formal reception rooms in the student center. So at the left, you're seeing it in its original location in 1898, and on the right is the sculpture itself. I was formally introduced to the work of Kentucky's, quote, girl sculptor, a moniker in use when Enid created this likeness. I was reintroduced to Enid in 2012 as I learned that she was initially selected to construct the Monument to the Confederate Dead of Louisville in 1894. A commission that was ultimately taken away from her. Upon realizing that Enid had won commissions for both of these monuments, one a bust in honor of the faculty member who fostered the education of young women, and the other a memorial to the sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers lost in the Civil War, I became interested in Enid as a research topic. This introduction to Enid, coupled with my background in public sculpture, inspired me to research her, to visit the places where she lived and worked, and to understand her life, work, and context. It was 5 years into the project that I realized Enid Yandell was a pioneer. To say that someone is a pioneer is to suggest that they are among the first to explore an area or to settle a land. Enid was clearly a pioneer in the field of public sculpture, and I will discuss some of those peculiarities tonight. Enid emerged, just like Daniel Boone, from the wilderness of details that was the sculpture milieu of the 19th century, the contours of which began here in Louisville. The theme of the pioneer, both in terms of Daniel Boone himself and other legendary figures, guides the discussion of Enid's longtime friendship with Reuben T. Durrett, shown here, who owned and shared relics of Boone. Enid's earliest monument to Boone for the Columbian Exposition in 1893 and subsequent versions, and the overall creation, display, and dissemination of Boone as part of Enid's sculptural identity throughout the next 40 years formed her career. Beyond the connection to Boone, Enid took on the subject of other pioneers, and she herself was referred to as such on several occasions, points that I will elaborate upon this evening. Enid's story and her biography provide a framework for examining the limitations female artists confronted in the field of sculpture during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The very act of shaping a substance and forcing its aesthetic form is a physically demanding practice. Enid's story and her pioneering spirit, importantly, give testament to how she overcame barriers to make significant contributions to contradict the prescriptive understanding of what it meant to be a woman sculptor. Enid's experiences reflect how the education and professionalization of women sculptors relied heavily upon the encouragement of male sculptors and the endorsement of established institutions to attract international acclaim. And while Enid was successful in garnering global recognition, she retained ties to the bluegrass state even as she traveled and relocated domestically and abroad for training, further education, and employment from 1887 on. In doing so, she established a professional identity that transcended geographical boundaries, all the while retaining an affinity for and anchors in the South. Her Southern roots informed her oeuvre and her outlook. They forged her identity. And I should say that the image on the left, the little box is too high. I tried to move it and couldn't move it. But Enid's right below where the box is, so let me get the pointer and show you. So hold on. Maybe. Okay, people. She's right. That's where she is. The little box got slippery there, so you get the point. So she's hanging out with women and she's working with women. That's the point. Born on October 6, 1869 in Louisville, Kentucky, Enid Bland Yandell was the eldest of 4 children of Louise Elliston Yandell and Confederate veteran surgeon and medical doctor Lunsford Pitt Yandell. So what you're looking at here on the left are her father and mother, and then the large image is Enid, and then on the right, Maud, Elsie, and Lunsford. So to put that into context, there's the family tree. Enid and Maud, neither of them married, and they're buried in Cave Hill. Elsie, who's the third in line, this is an image of her, and there's the clipping that details work that Enid had done for Elsie's marriage to Don Barber in 1899. And in the book, I recount the great lengths to which Elsie's daughter, then also an Elsie, which gets a little confusing if you're not in the Yandell family, all these Elsies, but she, Mrs. John J. Trask, richly contributed to Enid's legacy. Then fourth in line was Lunsford Pitts Yandell III. He's shown there on the left. Then the 2 images in the center are him from the Spanish-American War in that time period. And then on the bottom right, courtesy of the Yandell family, are images of a chair that Enid had made for one of Lunsford's children in 1902. And at the far right is a recent acquisition by the Filson of an engagement ring that Enid had made for Lunsford to give to his betrothed, Elizabeth Hosford. And it's not on view, and it's kind of a beautiful work. So as Nancy Baird and I were saying this afternoon, it's remarkable to think that Enid could design and create something that would fit on your finger, as well as a 40-foot tall sculpture. A prominent and conservative and Southern family, the Yandells lived in a comfortable Victorian home on Broadway between 3rd and 4th Streets, today the site of Brown Theater. Prior to living there, the family had a smaller home on the southeast corner of 7th and Magazine near the Medical College, where Lunsford worked, which was followed by a residence at 206 West Chestnut, near the City Hospital at Chestnut and Floyd. For 40 years, this tract of land between Chestnut and Broadway served as headquarters for the Yandell family. Lunsford's medical office was just to the west of Enid's childhood home, and the family attended Christ Church or one of its 10 sister Episcopalian churches. St. Paul's, where Enid earned a punctuality award for regular attendance in Sunday school during the first 3 months of the year in 1883. Interspersed among the medical buildings, churches, and social welfare humanitarian societies were businesses and entertainment venues, including Soldier's Confectionery, shown here on the far left, the Candy Kitchen, and Macaulay's Theater, all of which the budding sculptor frequented, if not for her own pleasures, those of her siblings. In 1883, 14-year-old Enid detailed her studio work and the effort she put forth in a letter to her grandmother. This earliest personal account of a studio practice was supplemented by her attendance at public spectacles, such as the Southern Exposition. At this annual event, held from 1883 to 1887 in her home city, Enid learned about art and cultural affairs. In the absence of a city art museum, this exposition functioned as a major exhibition venue for the budding artist in her hometown. A number of paintings, some of which were borrowed from local collectors and others secured from artist studios, contributed to the exhibits. Such signature works, even if copies, were on view with busts of civic leaders, including veterans. The decision for Enid to take up serious art study came after her father's death, though the decision was not a cause and effect, but rather one that was a long time coming. The arts were practiced by young girls of Enid's age, though a woman was not assumed to be a serious practitioner, but rather a dabbler in paint. Enid's mother, however, had at least one professional commission to her credit, copying a portrait of lawyer and politician Robert Crittenden that hung in the home of his widow in Frankfurt, shown here on the left. Enid pursued formal art education in 2 phases, as a teenager at Hampton College in Louisville and then in Cincinnati in 1887. At Hampton College, a private female academy with 14 faculty and a student body of approximately 280, Enid could take courses in drawing and painting from Miss Bartlett in the gymnasium, and this venue also served as a space for philanthropic events, thus conjoining 2 spheres of women's work, dilettante arts, and benevolence. Notice was regularly made of the activities of this former Keats residence, including excursions of the women to faraway places like Mammoth Cave. In an exhibition review from 1885, Enid was called, quote, the most advanced of all of the pupils. 2 years later, in September of 1887, Louise Yandell made an inquiry to the Art Academy of Cincinnati to seek her daughter's admission. Enid was enrolled at this fairly new educational endeavor, the art school. The 3rd floor of the building contained an antique room for storage of casts and space for displaying and copying them. Drawing from the nude or partially nude figure was also part of that educational practice. In addition to developing Enid as an artist in terms of skill and practice, Cincinnati afforded her the opportunity to engage with other artists, and attending the academy allowed her to see art firsthand. She had the privileges of the museum, which allowed students like her to enter the exhibition galleries and to copy works firsthand. All she had to do was show proof of enrollment. In addition, she was exposed to works of art that had garnered attention across the United States, such as Paul Filippo's Cyclorama, a panoramic painting of multidimensional illusion of the battlefield of Gettysburg, which was on view in Cincinnati after, quote, 4 years of continued success with no less than 1,000 persons attending daily. Throughout her education in Cincinnati, Enid proved to be a focused and ambitious student, covering a 4-year program in 2, thereby completing her time at the academy by 1889. Away from the city, Enid found peace in the country. One such place was Dinsmore Homestead in Boone County. In fact, the earliest mention of Enid's stays there appears to have been 1888, while she was making frequent trips to and from the Cincinnati's academy. She often commented on the food, and at the right is a quote from a piece that Enid had written under a pseudonym, but she wrote it in 1890, reflecting on the food and the luxury of food and the tastes in Boone County. Following her pursuit of art education and the reward of travel abroad in 1889, Enid engaged in spectacle of a different sort through her reign in 1890 as Queen of the Satellites of Mercury, an unusual and short-lived social event, an annual celebration in Louisville that served in some ways as a continuation of the Southern Exposition. The festival was intended to promote Louisville's growing material prosperity. Her reign as queen brought attention to attention despite her interest in her pursuit of a career. So determined to take it upon herself, she got her name out by brandishing business cards and invitations, inviting people to her studio, which is what you're seeing on the far left, that card. And then in the middle is the context of how that card is situated in her scrapbook, which is in the exhibition that's here at the Filson. And on the right is the bust of Durrett, which she created and exhibited that year in 1891. One of Enid's earliest commissions was on view at that studio display, this bust of Reuben Durrett, which captured his physical appearance at nearly 70 years old, with wavy hair, neatly trimmed beard, and dressed in a three-piece suit, of which the top of the jacket was single-breasted and the vest is barely visible with a tie. Enid attended to Durrett's interests as well in this depiction, showing his pocket watch chain complete with a T-bar and double chain, one for the watch and one to hold a cigar cutter, indicative of her subject's penchant for cigars. 5 somewhat precariously stacked books form the pedestal. They are the literal foundation of Durrett's work as a historian and bibliophile, and they're also books that he owned. Simultaneous to this bust, Enid took up architectural decoration in the early part of the 1890s. She developed ornamentation for the new Louisville Trust Building in 1891. Located several blocks from Enid's studio in the family home on Broadway between 3rd and 4th Streets, the Trust Building was designed by Louisville architects Mason Morey and William J. Dodd. After her education, travel abroad, and putting out her studio sign on Broadway, Enid set her sights on Chicago. She left the Bluegrass State in 1891 and took a position with the World's Columbian Exposition, an international exhibit aimed at attracting tourists to Chicago and at showcasing international achievements in art, science, and industry. To aid Enid in securing a position, Reuben Durrett wrote to Bertha Honore Palmer, a businesswoman, socialite, and philanthropist, originally from Louisville, who served as the president of the board of the Lady Managers. Durrett's recommendation, along with Enid's education and experience, secured a position for her. As part of her work, she was asked to reproduce the work of male sculptors and to create works entirely of her own. In this later category, Enid designed a series of columns of shaped, classically draped females called caryatids for the roof of the women's building. She also created the now well-known statue of Daniel Boone for the Kentucky State Building. Enid navigated many worlds while at the fair as an emerging professional, a hired hand, and as a Kentuckian. So what you're looking at here on the left is an image from Enid's scrapbook. Well, it's a series of photographs. It's not really a scrapbook, but and it's marked at the bottom, Martigny's studio. So Philip Martigny was one of the male sculptors who had a studio practice and brought in women to reproduce works. And it says World's Fair Art Building. And then on the right is a detail of that center sliver where you can see Enid on the stairs. So on the right is the sliver where you can see her on the stairs. And then I just blew that image up multiple times. So on the far right, you can see her seated on the stairs, and beneath her is a model for what would become the caryatids, which were along the top, which you see here on the left, the top form of this women's building. And so to put that into context, she not only created one piece that was larger than life size, she then reproduced it 23 times because there's 24 caryatids along the top of that building. And so that was a commission for which she won a gold medal, which is on view at the Speed Museum right now in their exhibition. And so she did that piece. She reproduced the work of male sculptors, and she made the Daniel Boone over a 2-year period. So this is an incredible amount of work. A few months into her work, on April 15th, 1892, Enid wrote to Durrett about her work and her drive. Quote, "I am studying hard, and I hope daily becoming a better and a bigger woman, if not a greater sculptor. But I know it is only by work one ever becomes great, so I labor on steadily." To which Durrett responded by sending along some cider to her, yay, a practice that he undertook over his years, sending these reminders and perhaps encouragements from home. Enid worked hard at Chicago, and for this she was rewarded specifically, as I mentioned, with a gold medal for the World's Fair. To fulfill her commission then for the Daniel Boone, Enid used props to prepare an authentic rendering by securing purported Boone relics, including his hunting shirt, flintlock, flintlock rifle, tomahawk, knife, and powder horn, which were in the possession of Durrett. Given the shortage of likenesses of her subject, Enid also relied upon the Filson's portrait of Boone for the facial treatment. She also seems to have read and researched widely, relying upon historical accounts of Boone, such as Collins' Historical Sketches of Kentucky from 1882. On the right is an image, well, it's two images, and the color isn't quite right. The middle image should be a little bit more brown, but this was a recent discovery, which I'm pleased to have made at the speed. It's an annotation, that's Enid's handwriting and her signature of her copy, her personal copy of a transcript of Collins' Historical Sketches of Kentucky, proving that she actually did research and read widely, and this is in the collection of the speed. The work, the Daniel Boone, was completed in staff, a white, plastery, impermanent material. A June 2nd, 1893 Louisville commercial article about the dedication of the sculpture at Chicago closed with a tribute to Miss Yandell and praised her brilliance in rising to the challenge to bring a Boone into motion. Such comments reflected how aptly Enid had succeeded in this endeavor. Quote, "It was reserved for the genius of a young Kentucky girl to have such a conception of the old pioneer and to embody it in a statue." Accolades came in from none other than Reuben Durrett himself, and from that point on, in 1893, Enid was associated with the pioneer. Enid also kept a small version of the Boone sculpture in her studio throughout her practice, thus demonstrating how her association with frontierism had been permanently affixed to her identity, giving her agency and contributing to her legacy. Such association extended to the legacy of the Confederacy as well, as Enid's success in Chicago with the Boone sculpture was reported throughout the South. The Confederate veteran noted her lineage as a Yandell, and with it came an expectation to contribute to the annual acts of commemoration. The article mentioned her next work, referring to the Confederate monument for which she was commissioned in 1894. She, meaning Enid, is at present making studies for a magnificent Confederate monument to be erected in one of our southern states. To put this into context, by the time she was awarded the commission to design the Confederate monument for Louisville at age 24, Enid had already embarked upon a career as a professional. She had already established herself as a talented, competitive, ambitious sculptor who could work for as well as alongside male professionals. What is more relevant in terms of our understanding of Enid's life and art is to also consider how the securing and eventual revocation of this commission for the Confederate monument offers a prism through which to discuss gender in a complex and nuanced way, a point that I won't elaborate upon much here, but which I discuss extensively in my book. But to return to the article from Confederate Veteran, it's important to note how the framing of Enid's life, and by extension her work, the article noted that she was a proud daughter of a Confederate soldier. The use of the term soldier within this context was particularly important, for while Enid's father was an officer and a surgeon, audiences of Southern statuary in the 1890s came to expect recognition of the ordinary soldier. So much so that over 60% of the Confederate monuments dedicated during this time period, so 1886 to 1889, featured a soldier rather than her officer, and her father was a medical surgeon, so not traditionally referred to as a soldier. For the monument in Louisville, the commission was to come from the Kentucky Women's Confederate Monument Association, which, like their sister organizations throughout the U.S., had as their mission a trio of duties: care of the Confederate dead, through burial, annual decoration, and the erection of monuments. These activities honored the past, the dead, and the lost cause. They in turn desired to bring the memorial beyond the gravesite, with statuary as a way to carve out literally a third space for commemoration outside the home and the graveyard. In contemplating her submission for the Louisville competition, Enid turned to classical sculpture to develop her idea for a monument to the Confederate dead. And what you're looking at on the left is her design that was published in the newspaper. In her design with architect William Dodd, Enid proposed an allegorical figure of a female of fame holding a wreath in one hand and a Confederate flag in the other. Fame stood triumphantly, appearing to have just alighted atop the Corinthian Capitol. By employing a woman in the figurative role, Enid gave her the burden of dual representation. On the one hand, fame, which can be interpreted as fame for the Confederate dead, signified the men who had earned prominence due to their individual and collective achievements. The second meaning, which is evident only through reading the iconography that Enid employed, along with the context of the commission, signifies victory. For while the South had lost the war and Kentucky and Louisville had lost so many men, the representation of victory was a necessary element to fertilize the myth of the lost cause. Moreover, the inclusion of a woman holding a flag and wreath enabled Enid to foreground the women of the movement, the women of the monument effort, as leading the charge and extolling the victory in honor of their husbands, brothers, sons, and fathers. After some controversy stemming primarily on the basis of this representation and not, as has been commonly asserted, Enid's gender, the commission was revoked from her and the Muldoon firm was commissioned to realize the monument which, until 2 years ago, stood just down the road from us here. After the Confederate monument controversy, Enid seemed to expand her travel to include back and forth oscillations between New York and Paris. She began work in 1896 while in Paris on her largest sculpture to date to be sited at the Tennessee Centennial, where grand classical buildings in a park-like setting, highlighted walkways, and water features ruled the day. The overall theme of this fair, which adopted mythological and classical subjects, included the Fine Arts Building's full-scale reproduction of the Parthenon atop the Acropolis, shown here. Nashville was referred to as the Athens of the South. So in keeping with this theme, Enid created a colossal sculpture of the goddess Athena. And you can just see the little hint of it off to the left, but you'll see some other images in the next few slides. Enid's colossal figure of Athena, 40-foot tall staff material, took between 9 and 10 months to create and was created while she was living in Paris, and doing so between sips of cider, with instruction with fellow artists, and taking in the pleasures of the center of the art world as a way to connect also with home. In fact, the site of the Tennessee Centennial was converted farmland, a portion of which had belonged to Enid's family through her mother's line. Enid had spent a great deal of time there, as evidenced by a handful of photographs taken of her there as she was at work, and also when she created this on site. The execution of Athena was a measure of pride and happiness, so much so that she threw a celebration inside the belly of the goddess on the eve of its colossal journey across, well, technically up to Antwerp and then over across the ocean and then down to the Mississippi and up the Mississippi Road to Nashville. So it was on a long ride. After Tennessee, Enid made her rounds on the World's Fair circuit, playing toe-to-toe with male sculptors working in monumental forms. At Buffalo for the 1901 fair, Enid richly contributed by sending along a handful of smaller works which she termed figurines, as well as larger pieces like the one shown here, a plaster entitled Struggle of Existence, which was located in the Rose Garden and offered a naturalistic setting for the writhing classical figures. This piece was a full-size model of a memorial fountain shown here at the left, for which she beat out 18 male competitors for the Carrie Brown Memorial Fountain in Providence, Rhode Island. So on the left is the fountain in Providence. On the right is Enid's Paris studio with the model of that fountain. And then this slide shows Enid's scrapbook, which is at the University of Louisville. And inside the scrapbook are annotations, not in Enid's hand, but I don't know whose hand, of remarks, largely derogatory, about the pieces underneath. So she took the clippings about the other artists' representations, so their submissions. She took the clippings from the newspaper, cut them out, pasted them in her scrapbook, and there's notes on top of each of them, but not in her handwriting. So I'm not sure whose handwriting, but it's comments about the other sculptors' poor work. For the St. Louis Fair, Enid sent Daniel Boone, although a slightly different approach was taken in its presentation than at Chicago and Nashville in 1897. Here, Boone was situated on top of a pedestal, a traditional presentation that would call to mind national heroes, statesmen, political figures. In addition, Enid created another statue entitled Victory for 2 restaurants in the Cascade Gardens, an area near the center of the fair. These final entries to the World's Fair serve as evidence of her growth as a sculptor in terms of her interest in classical subjects and her association with Daniel Boone. However, after submitting to the World's Fair in St. Louis, Enid detached from these spectacles and instead focused on developing sculpture that would be made of enduring materials and long-lasting. Simultaneous to this desire to see her works in such material, Enid also became engaged in reform work of the 1890s, an effort that took full flower in the first decade of the 20th century, when she also established a home and life in Edgartown, Massachusetts. I'll discuss her life in Edgartown shortly, but first want to focus on how Enid was coming into her own as a compassionate humanitarian who put the needs of others before hers. Enid's pathway to advocacy and activism came to full fruition during her Edgartown years, specifically her service to World War I effort and her engagement in the suffrage movement, though its roots may be traced to her interests largely at the encouragement of her mother in her benevolent work outside the home. The women who commissioned Enid to create memorials in honor of J.J. Rucker and Emma Willard, both shown here, were of Enid's mother's generation. Their activities outside the home cohered with religious and educational work. They shared their interests and the aims of Louise Elliston Yandell and Elizabeth Bodie Elliston, chief among them women's education, a right to which Enid had already been the beneficiary. Parallel to her own achievements, Enid engaged in social reform movements through her work on the campaign for universal suffrage, as well as through relief efforts for French artists, soldiers, and families during World War I. On the national and local level, women and a few men organized meetings and lectures, carried petitions door to door, and served as the boots on the ground to gain support simultaneously for the cause of women's suffrage and to deflect antagonism. As part of this, we know that Enid participated in one exhibition and one parade in support of women's suffrage. So in the book, I talk about the ways in which she kind of engaged in this work to support women's suffrage. And we knew that Enid had always participated in the suffrage exhibitions because those are documented with lists that indicate like who was exhibiting and what their work sold for and how much they made. And that money would have been split with the artist and been sent on to the suffrage cause. This was a discovery that I made while researching Enid's story, and I'm delighted to share it because it hadn't been known before, but also because I think it's really amazing to see Enid at this moment. I go through possibilities as to when this image was taken, and I settled upon October of 1915. But you see in the blue box there, Enid is at the far left, and her sash says Votes for Women. And she's wearing a hat and this sort of long skirt and outfit, and then next to her in the center is Janet Scudder, one of her friends from art school in Cincinnati, and Janet is holding this banner that says Sculptors, and then next to her, so on the far right, is a person whose identity, you just can't tell, the image isn't clear enough. And they're holding the banner Sculptors, and it's the first time I've ever seen that banner represented in a photographic image as well. So the way this would work is part of the participation in suffrage parades would be sort of going along with a cohort. So Enid identified with the cohort of sculptors, and they then would walk along, and I think this is Fifth Avenue in October of 1915. So it's really exciting to see, but it's also interesting to think about Enid actually engaged in this work, the suffrage parades. So if we think about this parade, and we consider the last time Enid was in a parade, we know that she participated in the satellites of Mercury. So within 25 years, approximately, she's gone from being a spectacle to participating for political engagement. Enid's activism was not limited to women's suffrage. At home and abroad, visiting Paris, Enid worked in support of women, children, and French soldiers as part of a larger aid effort by artists and for artists. She came back to the U.S. in 1915 and traveled across the states to make speeches to garner financial support for and to help those suffering. Working for the Red Cross at Hoboken, New Jersey, Enid established an indexing system for the Debarkation Records Department. She is shown here in her office with her team, who aspired to locate the index cards corresponding to a given soldier's location within 5 minutes, an astonishing feat given that the American sick and wounded were spread among 42 general hospitals, 16 base hospitals, 7 camp hospitals, and 8 debarkation hospitals. The system had 200,000 cards on file representing all of the men brought back to America. and Enid professed that each card represented a soldier's life. So if one of the clerks drops a card, Enid says, quote, "She feels so badly as though the card were the wounded soldier himself." So by purporting that they were able to find someone's location within 5 minutes was a pretty remarkable feat. And Enid is at the center of the image on the left and at the image on the right as well. After this four-year period of intense activism and advocacy, Enid wrapped up her Red Cross service in 1919. In support of the organization and perhaps as a reminder of her accomplishments and service to others, she continued to wear her Red Cross lapel pin for years. She kept it among her decorations and badges from a lifetime of artistic and philanthropic awards and achievements. Simultaneous to her engagement in reform and activism, Enid was developing an identity as an entrepreneur, and much of that was enmeshed in her relocation to Edgartown, a place that she first visited in 1907 before purchasing property there and continuing to summer there from 1908 until her death in 1934. In these dealings, put simply, Enid could exploit the perspective that she had gained professionally and personally over these years. She purchased property with the hope of transitioning to a life on the island, a place that was entirely new to her, perhaps as a respite from the city life in New York. There she established the Brandstock Studio and with John Johansson ran a program of courses for several years. Enid's commissioned pieces and sales from about 1910 on revolved around small-scale works. For instance, she carved figureheads and trail boards for sailboats that represented the Edgartown Yacht Club in area competitions. However, based upon newspaper accounts of transatlantic travel over those years, we can piece together factual bits about information to understand how she moved about in these locational bases. Between 1912 and 1914, she conceptualized her chief Vinaigrette, shown on the right where it's installed. This work serves as doubles as a fountain in the tourist cove of Watch Hill, Rhode Island. She designed this while she was in Paris, shown at the far left, based upon her studies of a person from Buffalo Bill's Wild West show who joined Enid in her studio to show that she could design from life rather than having to rely upon a photograph. She created a plaster model, shown in the center, which was brought back to the United States and exhibited at the Armory Show in 1913. The full-size sculpture was cast in 14 in Paris and dedicated in Watch Hill the same year. It's unclear what role if Edgartown played in this sculpture's creation, but it's one of the works that Enid created during these transatlantic years. Another work that she created over these years was a departure from these realistic, monumental, or memorial works. It's inspired by Kenneth Graham's children's book, The Wind in the Willows. The entire set is depicted by an undated photograph of the beast on a dress table. So I'm referring to on the far left, the photograph of image that I keep using. It has a lot in it. And so you're seeing her standing with her little Red Cross lapel pin. She's got some tools in her hands, and then behind the figure, which I'll talk about in a second, are the Wind in the Willows figures, which are shown on the middle and right in color, like a more contemporary photograph. The entire set is depicted in an undated photograph, and we know these items were called Brandstock birthday beasts. And Enid identified herself as the artist and then also added a copyright symbol in Edgartown, Massachusetts, indicating her authority over these miniatures. Drawing attention and inspiration from a work of children's literature, the birthday beasts were intimately tied to Enid's identity as a sculptor, business owner, islander, and served as miniature works of art as Enid sought to engage new audiences. Following the war, given her age and her interest in teaching, exhibition, and small-scale commissions, Enid seemed to have pursued one significant large-scale competition, the Pioneer Monument. It was an effort of a local group of citizens in Harrodsburg to construct a memorial to the early settlers of the state. The competition for this commission drew the most prized American sculptors of the day. Upon winning the competition in 1924, Enid returned to Kentucky, literally and figuratively, by making visits to the sculpture site at Harrodsburg and reviving the subject with which her occupational identity was first cast, that of Daniel Boone. Although the Pioneer Monument was incomplete at the time of Enid's death, its commission and framing were significant in terms of content and how this project expanded her body of work. In terms of content, as noted in a lecture that Enid gave in 1924, the pioneer men and women were a part of her conceptualization. Moreover, her inclusion of women in the narrative as active participants rather than sorrowful soon-be widows was unusual. While starkly contrasting with the narrative proffered by historical record, Enid's design for the Pioneer Monument was in keeping with the spirit of her commissioned projects related to advocacy and activism of the previous 2 decades. Moreover, the purpose of this design was, at that historical moment, the 1920s, significant in affirming women's agency and the broader connection to the early 20th century shift into heritage tourism associated with pioneerism and monumental work. It's no wonder that Enid was selected to design the monument at Harrodsburg, and shown here, she's part of a party that was driving in the stakes to kind of begin this movement of this monument making at Harrodsburg. She could draw not only on her abilities as an artist, but also on her association with her home state. Leading the praise was her native city, whose newspaper proclaimed her victory in securing the commission. The Louisville Herald wrote, "A woman 3 times a pioneer in art is chosen to do a pioneer monument at Harrodsburg." Simultaneous to this project, Enid began reproducing smaller versions of Daniel Boone, tabletop in size, which is the sculpture you see at the foreground there. This pioneer functioned like a resume, if you will, by offering a glance to the past and Enid's first professional commission as a sculptor, the Daniel Boone, which she created for the Kentucky Building at the World's Fair. This later tabletop plaster functioned as a stand-in for Boone, an abbreviation of her previous efforts in its simplicity. It is, however, important to note that Enid included this work in a professional photograph of herself that she had taken in her studio. To end, I think it's appropriate to consider Enid's legacy and that of her hard-fought victories over her past decades and her self-actualization. I just love this picture. There's no reason to include it. There really isn't. Collections here in Louisville, Edgartown, and Providence have been built around Enid's work, as has scholarship and exhibitions, although this sesquicentennial year of Enid Yandell has done much to enrich and expand our understanding of her and her legacy. Enid is, in homage, inspiration, and brand, perhaps best exemplified through the formation of the eponymous artist collective, Enid, Generations of Sculptors, a regionally based collective founded in 1998, 100 years after Enid Yandell was elected as among the first women of the National Sculpture Society. While their selection of Enid's name as their namesake may seem obvious to us today in 2019, consider that the group was founded in the middle years of collection building that fostered Enid's legacy. The group Enid has richly contributed through word, deed, and exhibition to the persistence and expansion of Enid's legacy today. Stunning exhibitions currently on view at 21C, Louisville Free Public Library, and Bellarmine offer firsthand glimpses of Enid's legacy. Another example of legacy is the long history of Enids Boon, which was cast finally in bronze for the city of Louisville under the patronage of cigar maker C.C. Bickle. At the dedication in 1906 in Cherokee Park, amid a streaming rain, 50,000 were in attendance to see Enids Boon in permanence. 60 years later, S. Vest Parker captured American television viewers' attention with his interpretation of Daniel Boone from 1964 to 1970. A bronze replica of Enids Boon was being planned for Eastern Kentucky University in Richmond. Very shortly after the statue's dedication, on May 3rd, 1967, a tradition was born. It is said that if a student rubs the statue's toe, the student will have good luck. And after 50 years of wishful rubbings, the tip of one of Daniel's high moccasins reveals a sheen that could never have been imagined by Enid when she created the initial staff version. I know, I laugh when I think of that too. The initial staff version for the Kentucky Building at the Chicago World's Fair. Enid's reach extends beyond sculpture to include prints, quilts, rug hookings, and dramatic works. The latter of these is a stunning piece by Nancy Gall Clayton called Yes, I Cut Marble, Mrs. Grant, where Clayton offers a debate on the proper role of women in 1891 by situating 3 generations: a sculptor in her 20s, a middle-aged activist philanthropist, and the aging widow of President Grant. Stanley, this one's for you. Where's Stanley? Ah, there's Stanley. There's Stanley Chase. Thanks, Stanley. Another example of legacy is the long history of Enids Boon. Oh, sorry, I read the wrong line. Beyond sculpture and other works, a third example of Enid's legacy reaching beyond sculpture involves foodways, or more aptly, foodie culture, as we see with Louisville vegan jerky company's Enid's Perfect Pepperoni, which we have samples of, which Stanley Chase has kindly given us. So founded in 2012 by Stanley Chase, Louisville Vegan Jerky Company introduced a series of vegan barbecue tofu named after local individuals. And it's only fitting that they are the sponsor of this birthday bash. Other perhaps ephemeral examples include, for instance, the signature cocktail of Enid Rocks, comprising bourbon, pecan liqueur, chocolate bitters, which debuted on the afternoon of the unveiling of the banner to Enid on the side of the Harbison building across from 21C. And of course, the app, The Whole Story, which enables visitors to place Enid's representation of Athena along that stretch of downtown. So this looks kind of wonky, but what you're looking at, well, it's a drink on the left, but then in the middle and on the right is the app called The Whole Story, which you can download on your phone. And if you're standing like I am in that middle picture with a bunch of construction workers at the corner of 7th and Main, you can download the app, and then you can use the app to place a holographic image, which you're seeing in the far center, of Enid's Palace Athena from 1897 from the Tennessee Centennial. So you can actually place that wherever you're standing and take a picture of it. It's really kind of fun, so I encourage you to try it. Another example is the trolley tour led by architect and historian Steve Weiser this past weekend, offering visitors a closer look at the spaces and places of Enid's Louisville. So in sum, I think it's pretty clear that Enid Yandell was truly a pioneer in her field of sculpture, in her casting of an association with Daniel Boone, in her ingenious conception of 3D form, and her entrepreneurial endeavors. Throughout her life, though, too, she was tethered to activism and reform, and as an extension of the work her mother and grandmother fostered. It's no wonder that her legacy is so deeply tied to Kentucky, and in particular Louisville. These aforementioned collective actions have served two purposes. First, to draw our attention to Enid's transition from a Southern dilettante, daughter of a Confederate officer and a mentee of men, to an internationally recognized sculptor of large-scale, award-winning works, an independent woman engaging in art and activism. Second, they remind us and enable us on Enid's 150th birthday to have a greater understanding of her life, work, and legacy by focusing on her contributions to the field, by reviewing her within the context of the era of which she was a part, and by acknowledging how Enid Yandell was truly a pioneer. Thank you.